All right, well, good morning, everyone. Soon to be good afternoon. Welcome to our first Leadership Bloomington Monroe County Leadership at Lunch session today. Today, we're going to look at a historical perspective on racism in our community, presented today in partnership with the Monroe County History Center. We're very proud to have a great relationship with the History Center and appreciate them joining us today. We're really excited to debut this new series in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic to continue to engage our community and provide the true tenets of the Leadership Bloomington Monroe County program during this time. Our goal is to continue to connect citizens to our community and develop those leadership skills that Leadership Bloomington Monroe County has done for decades. My name is Trisha Riviere-Stumps, and I'm the director of LBMC. And I'll try to make your online experience great today with all of our technicians and hosts on the back end today. Additionally, I want to recognize and thank the sponsors of Leadership Bloomington Monroe County, the IU Credit Union, German American Bank, One World Enterprises, and First Insurance Group. We truly couldn't host this program today and our traditional multi-month course without their support. So thank you so much to those sponsors and supporters of our program. Also, don't forget to check out our Leadership Bloomington Facebook page to stay up to date, and also continue to stay up to date with our other emails. We're going to be announcing our future programs here later this week, and the next one on October 1st, which I'll mention before we conclude today. We'll also be sending out information about this year's Leadership Bloomington Monroe County Distinguished Alumni Award very soon, and please stay tuned to our communications for that. With that, I would like to highlight a few important Zoom webinar features that will make your experience great today. First, all of you, our participants and attendees today, are muted, and there's also no video feature today, so that we can highlight our presenters and speakers so you can see their faces, as well as the audio and visual that we have for you today. So you can sit back, relax, and enjoy the presentation for the next hour and a half. One of the features that we do want you to be aware of in Zoom is that you'll want to utilize the Q&A function. So for people on PCs, that's found on your dashboard at the bottom of your screen. And for tablet and smartphone users, click on that three-dot ellipse at the far right of your controls for a drop-down menu. For smartphone and tablet users, if you don't see your dashboard options at the bottom of the screen, just tap anywhere and they will appear. Clicking on that Q&A option will open a box on your screen. This is where we want you to type your questions for our speakers. Our panelists will keep an eye out on those questions. We'll try to chat back if possible, and we'll also have time at the end today for your questions, and we really look forward to that and hope you submit your questions. Another feature is the chat box. This is where you can have a conversation with other attendees and what we are using as you were beginning here today. So please feel free to use that chat box feature as well. You can close that after you're done, but you can also keep it open to continue to see a running view of the discussions that are happening. You can also check out who else is attending today with us by clicking on the participants button for a list of attendees at the bottom. A final note today is that our session is being recorded, and we hope to have this available for all of you to reference back and also to send to our supporters of LBMC at this great, important, and timely topic. I really appreciate your willingness to connect with all of us virtually this year, support LBMC, and we look forward to seeing you at future sessions. But for now, I'm going to turn this over to Jennifer Borland, LBMC class of 2013 and alumni board member. She's also president of the Monroe County Historical Society and will moderate our session this morning. Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Trisha. Well, you did a great introduction of me, so I'm going to skip right to it and tell you a little bit more about what we're going to be doing today. So earlier this year, when we were discussing what the LBMC program might look like during the COVID pandemic, the idea was put forth to host a special series of programs to help local leaders and community members be more prepared to respond to the unique demands of the pandemic and the string of incidents that were involving police brutality, injustice, and unequal treatment of people of color within our country and within our community. I believe really firmly that better understanding our history is the key to unlocking greater awareness and compassion and becoming more empowered to actively oppose racism. So today's presentation was designed to be a high-level overview of the history of Black people's fight for freedom, fight for equal employment and educational opportunities, and fight for true equality, nationwide, statewide, and right here within Monroe County. It's my pleasure today to introduce my collaborators and co-presenters. Betty Bridgwaters is a lifelong resident of Bloomington and a member of the Board of Trustees of the Monroe County Historical Society. Audrey McCluskey is a local author, scholar, and IU faculty member. Jim and Liz Mitchell. Jim is a former Indiana State and Bloomington police officer, and Liz was Bloomington's first Black female postal worker and a prolific creator of films and plays that highlight the history of African Americans, including those within our local community. Glenda Murray is our Monroe County historian and also a graduate of the LBMC program. Susan Dyar is another LBMC graduate and also the director of the Monroe County History Center. And I already introduced myself. So before I turn things over to our first presenter, I'd also like to thank the great team at IU, especially the IU Alumni Association, for all of their help in hosting today's event. And to Tricia especially for her great leadership of the LBMC program, especially in this strange year. And I'd like to thank all of our attendees and encourage you to keep posting questions in the chat window throughout today's presentation. We're going to do our best to keep answering those and follow up after today's session as well, if that's necessary. We've got a lot of ground to cover, and we're going to do our best to get to everything we plan to discuss. And we do plan to share out digital resources as well as copies of the presentation and make those available. So if we have to skip anything in the interest of getting everybody out of here by 1 o'clock on the dot today, we apologize in advance, but we'll definitely make all of this information available to everyone. So it is now my pleasure to turn things over to Susan Dyar and let her begin this historical journey with us.
Thank you, Jen. And I do want to thank Jen also for all the work that she did to help us pull this together. I also want to thank Liz and Audrey and Jim and Betty for adding their voices and perspectives to really give this conversation depth. So we're going to start really early in our community history and say Black residents have been living in Bloomington and Monroe County and making contributions long before the United States came to be, and certainly before our community was founded. Andrew Ferguson served in the Continental Army after escaping capture by the British Army in Virginia. He's the only Black American Revolutionary War veteran of record known to be buried in Monroe County. Based on the Northwest Ordinance passed by the U.S. Congress in 1787, slavery was prohibited in the Northwest Territory. So when Indiana became a state in 1816, the state's constitution stated there would be no involuntary servitude. Nevertheless, vestiges of these illegal practices lingered on in the state for many years. By the 1840 census, there were only 3 enslaved people reported in the state of Indiana and none by the next census. As southern states started increasing restrictions on free Black men and women prior to the Civil War, many started moving north and were ultimately forced to do so when southern states later prohibited them from residing as free people within those states. The early Blacks who settled in Indiana came from Kentucky, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. Many settled in self-sufficient communities of African Americans, including one called Lick Creek, nearby Orange County. These communities were often doing just as well economically as their white counterparts, but residency in these started to dwindle in the 1860s when residents started selling off their land, sometimes at a large loss considering the improvements they'd made, with some moving to Canada where they'd still be free if the Union lost the Civil War. There were also oppressive laws being passed at the state level during the mid-1800s. Indiana legislators, fearing that taxpayers would be forced to support Blacks coming to Indiana from nearby slave states, passed a law in 1831 that required free persons of color to post a bond of $500 as a guarantee of good behavior. That would be the equivalent of more than $14,000 today. In 1851, a new state constitution adopted in Indiana forbid Blacks from coming into the state at all. Blacks already residing in the state had to have 1 prominent person or 2 white people attest to the fact that they had been living here prior to 1850. The law also voided all contracts with Blacks, including land sales, and there were financial penalties for both Blacks and whites who violated the new law. From 1845 to 1860, Bloomington and Monroe County had very active stops along the Underground Railroad, which was a network of people and places that helped those fleeing slavery escape to places where they could enjoy a free life. Due to the fugitive slave law and the presence of bounty hunters throughout this area, that essentially meant having to move to Canada to be free. Many Covenanters, part of a group of Scotch-Irish Presbyterians from South Carolina, who had settled in the southeastern part of Bloomington, were actively engaged in helping Black men and women on their journey to freedom. There's also been a lot of recent scholarship to learn more about local Black residents who also served as conductors on the Underground Railroad. Liz Mitchell will now share more on the story of a freedom seeker named Robert Anderson, who found his way to Bloomington thanks to the Underground Railroad in this clip.
So yeah, he can tell you that. I'm going to show you. You see this?
Yes.
Robert Anderson. He was white and his slave master. His mother was a slave, and his father was his slave master. And he wrote an article or was interviewed, I don't know what year, and he said he was traded for a wagon by his father. And of course, white men didn't acknowledge having Black kids. He said he remembered the first time he saw his dad, came by and asked for a drink of water and just stared at him, and then left on a horse. And the lady, some lady you called auntie, you called all these Black women auntie back then, said, that's your dad. And he remembered then, really? And just turned around and watched this man ride off on a horse. But his father was his slave master. He left, there's different stories. Now, his family said it's not true that he was hiding here when the war ended. I don't know for sure what that is. But the tale is that he was hiding in either Ferris or Smith House or something like that with the Covenanters when the war ended. But anyway, he did stay here. He had a farm, what they considered farmland at that time. The family is still in the house, because out in that area where Covenanter Cemetery was farmland. And that's where, you know, he raised his family.
Now, during the Civil War, there were many Southern sympathizers in Monroe County because several residents had come from and still had family ties to the South. During the early months of the conflict, recruiters from Union-colored regiments in other states came to Indiana to enlist Black men to fight in the Civil War. Indiana was known to have several well-established free Black communities at that time. Recruits were offered pay as well as transportation to the state they would be fighting on behalf of. The image on the right from the History Center's collection shows James Spaulding's 1867 application for enlistment as a private in a regiment for colored troops at Leavenworth, Kansas. He was 74 years old at the time of his enlistment. Other local Black men were known to have joined up with troops in Massachusetts as well. We also have a copy of an article from the Herald Telephone in 1909 that tells us that Black veterans gathered in Bloomington for a reunion hosted by Second Baptist Church at that time. In 1842, Richard Walden bequeathed land in Spencer to his brother and sister to be used as a cemetery for himself and his colored friends who were veterans of the war. On January 1, 1863, even though the Civil War would continue for almost 2.5 more years, slavery was abolished in the U.S. under a mandate from Abraham Lincoln. And even though the end of the Civil War in April of 1865 made it that much more official, this was just the beginning of the subsequent fight for the fair and equal treatment of Blacks in America. The 14th Amendment, passed in 1868, gave Black people equal protection under the law. And in 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed giving male Black Americans the right to vote. During the brief Reconstruction period, lasting from 1865 to 1877, Blacks took on elected roles, especially in the South, but whites, particularly in the South, took objection to being on equal footing. So Jim Crow laws were established to marginalize Black people and keep them separate from whites. Black people couldn't use the same restrooms, live in the same towns, or go to the same schools, and many were no longer able to vote because voter literacy tests had been enacted. Locally, throughout the 1860s and into the 1880s, there were many Blacks coming to Monroe County from southern states. Blacks resettled in Bloomington because of employment opportunities, such as those provided by the Showers Furniture Factory, which started employing Blacks in 1868, and in other service jobs resulting from the growing university. I'd now like to turn things over to Audrey Thomas McCluskey, a local author, historic scholar, and an IU faculty member, to provide additional historical context for this time period.
Good morning, everyone, and I am very happy to participate in what I think is a very important function, and to congratulate the History Center and the Leadership Committee for putting this together. So my task today is to give a broader view about what's going on in the country. And my topic is the Great Migration. It took place between 1915 and 1970. And I want to begin with this first slide, which shows Black people leaving, going north. And you could see that they packed very lightly, and they were striding towards freedom. I have two perspectives that helps to contextualize this print from Jacob Lawrence's series called The Great Migration, which we will talk about much later. One perspective is from a scholar, a contemporary scholar who was observing what was happening. And this is what he said. They fled as if under a spell or a high fever. They left as if fleeing some curse. Second slide, please. This slide, also from the Lawrence series, The Great Migration, shows that Black people were getting out of the South on anything smoking. And this is a scene from, of course, a railroad station. They're ready to go. They're ready for freedom. And the second perspective is from Langston Hughes, poet Langston Hughes, and a character that he created named Jesse B. Simple. And Jesse B. Simple was an everyman, but he was also a philosopher. And this is what Jesse B. Simple said: I'd rather be a lamppost in New York City than the mayor of Georgia. Now that's not a malaprop, he meant mayor of Georgia. It was the largest movement of people within the continental United States ever. Historians have dubbed it the Great Migration. And why was it great? It transformed the United States in almost every aspect of life. Culture, including language, style, jobs, the economy, arts, social and political change, housing, education, criminal justice, and athletics, for sure. Migration helped to ignite the coming civil rights movement. In a period of just 60 years, it's estimated that more than 6 million Black Americans left the Jim Crow South, when after the Civil War had granted them freedom, and there was a short-lived Reconstruction period in which the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were passed, as Susan has mentioned. There were still very constraining prospects for African Americans. However, during the Reconstruction period, when Black men were newly enfranchised and elected to legislators, they were able to pass for the first time in the South universal primary education. Although confined, oppressed, and terrorized. So the option was what to do about it. Sure, the North had won the war, but the South won the narrative. And what do I mean by that? The public statues and monuments. How many of the victorious Union soldiers and Union soldiers and generals do you see? No, we are still fighting on the losing side. The statues and monuments lionize the Southern lost cause. And in the words of Supreme Court Justice Taney in the Dred Scott decision, he said, and I quote, "White men were not bound to any rights, no rights for Black men, and of course women. Lynchings were a favorite pastime to which white families brought picnic baskets, and some took home souvenirs of the victim's body. The body part that they most favored, well, you can imagine, it showed the psychosis of fear and envy that many whites felt towards Black men. But let us not forget that Black women were also lynched. Land that Black men and women had worked and toiled on during enslavement and in freedom had actually worked and actually bought land was often confiscated from them. The Ku Klux Klan became the most prolific, but by no means the only white terrorist organization, who, as we now see, is rising to the fore with official backing even today. So this was on the cusp of the First World War, World War I, in which Black soldiers, including my 19-year-old grandfather, McKinley West, they enlisted to quote, and this is the theme of the First World War, "Make America safe for democracy." However, it was the democracy that eluded them when they returned home. So Black Americans left the South in droves to the industrializing North. Using a biblically appropriated term, they were seeking the promised land and also the warmth of other suns. And that is the title of a groundbreaking book by journalist Isabel Wilkerson, A Warmer Sun. In 1910, about 90% of African Americans lived in the South. By 1970, it was 50%. So that shows you the movement. Slide 3, please. They were moving from field to factory. They were searching for dignity and respect, for good paying jobs, education for their children. However, the North was no promised land. It did not welcome them with open arms. They were crammed into substandard schools and housing, intentionally creating the urban ghettos of Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, Cleveland, Gary, where redlining, that practice of disinvestment and rejection of loans by banks for Blacks to keep them out of white enclaves and better paying jobs. They still bought homes at very inflated prices. And yet the migrants persisted. They kept on coming. Slide 4, please. This, again, from the migration series, showed the building of homes and businesses, but also reading of newspapers. The Black press was very important in the Great Migration. The Black press, including journals like the Chicago Defender, were carried back to the South by Black Pullman car porters who told about the jobs and opportunities in the North, which also accelerated the migration. One of those migrants was Sarah Breedlove, also known as Madam C.J. Walker, whose parents had been enslaved and were sharecroppers. She arrived in Indianapolis by way of St. Louis on her way to becoming America's first self-made woman millionaire. That all of these cities that I've mentioned elected their first Black mayors is directly linked to the migration. In 1967, Carl Stokes became the first big city mayor, Black big city mayor elected. He and his family were from Georgia. Coleman Young in Detroit also was from the South. Harold Washington in Chicago was from Mississippi. Ed Bradley in Los Angeles was born in Texas. Richard Hatcher in Gary was born in Indiana, but his parents were from the South. David Dinkins in New York City, all were sons of migrants from the South. And the myth that migrants were uncouth and lazy is just that. It's a myth. Slide 5, please. This shows the jealousy and envy. We know now about the Tulsa riots, but they were taking place on a smaller scale all over. So when Blacks in the North created homes and businesses, they were often burned to the ground. And this image captures that. So migrants were strivers, intent on a better life, still believing, despite hostility and envy from whites that led to race riots in the cities, burning of buildings, they remained, as poet Margaret Walker says, believers. Black migration also led to a cultural explosion that is the essence of the Black aesthetic that we still deeply celebrate. Gospel, urban blues, jazz. John Coltrane was from North Carolina. Dizzy Gillespie was from South Carolina. R&B up north became the defining genres of America's popular culture, and still are. The literary explosion of the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s is also attributed to the Great Migration. Introduced us to writers such as Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, Nella Larson, and so many more. Chicago had its own Renaissance as well, led by writers such as Richard Wright, who was from Mississippi. In sports, John Naismith invented basketball, but we all know that superstars emerged to define it, including greats like Wilt the Stilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell. Russell's father moved his family from Monroe, Louisiana to Oakland, California after a very racist incident. So in music, in sports, in language, in style, in fashion, everybody wanted to be Black, especially on a Saturday night. The paintings that I use are from the visual history that I mentioned by renowned artist Jacob Lawrence, The Great Migration. And they have been exhibited around the world, and you can see them all over by just simply Googling them. So in conclusion, this presentation on the Great Migration is but a brief digest of the great and transformative changes that African Americans have gifted to this country through their continuing struggle for justice and equality, while vowing to accept nothing less than full and unconditional citizenship. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. That was great. Now we'll go back into our local community. Throughout Monroe County's history, Blacks have faced challenges gaining access to housing. As Audrey was mentioning, like other places in the United States, Black families were often forced to rent homes because of discriminatory practices that kept them from being able to purchase them. Discriminatory lending policies known as redlining made it hard, if not impossible, for Blacks to get home loans for any property outside of redline districts. Federal policies often required housing developers to ensure that homes would only be sold to whites, and up until the civil rights laws were passed in the late 60s, Mortgages often contained clauses that prevented homeowners from selling to anyone who was not of pure white descent. The Showers Company factory burned on the east side of town in 1884, and a new factory with access to the Monon Railroad line was rebuilt on the west side. The Showers brothers saw that as an opportunity, and they developed their own savings and loan company to make loans to employees to buy houses. And they bought and subdivided land near the new factory that they encouraged Blacks to purchase. Black families were pushed out of their homes on the east side so that whites could move to the area to be near the new university site once IU moved from the Seminary Square area. This area, highlighted in pink, is where Hoagie Carmichael grew up and was exposed to jazz music that he went on to make a career of, with little or no credit attributed to the original sources for the songs he claimed to have written. Black residents were allowed to purchase homes on the near west side, north of Kirkwood and west of College, but there have been long-standing challenges purchasing anywhere other than this part of town.
I'd like to play a short clip from an interview that Audrey Thomas McCluskey recently conducted with local resident Robert Motley.
When I got to Bloomington, I couldn't rent any place. I was denied rent, a rental property. And they would say, oh, it's not me, it's my fault, so, like the owners. But I did rent a house on the west side, and then in 1967, I bought a lot here where I'm living at now, and had my house built in 1968, and right in my deed, know what it said?
What did it say?
Do not sell to Negroes.
Churches have always played an important role in community life for Black residents of Monroe County. The two West Side churches, Bethel AME Church, founded in 1870, and Second Baptist Church, founded in 1872, remain active in the community today. Following the Civil War, Mattie Jacobs Fuller was indentured to an Indiana physician, even though this was considered illegal. At the age of 14, she was released from that indenture and trained in Louisville as a beautician. She opened a beauty salon in the Allen Building at 108 East Kirkwood, and she was well known in town for her efforts to help raise more than $13,000 to help pay for the construction of the Bethel AME Church. She did so by playing a portable organ on the square and in other spots where people gathered for events. And my understanding is that organ is still at Bethel AME Church. In 1869, a law was passed in Indiana that indicated that colored students could be educated in public schools. Prior to that, at the Center School in Bloomington, built in 1854 at the corner of 6th and Washington, where the History Center now stands, Black students received instruction on the second floor of the small building that measured only 40.5 by 26.5 feet. White children held classes on the first floor. In 1874, a new center school was built, and the old center school became the colored school and was the location where all Black students attended school until 1914, when the Cirrhosis Club claimed the land to build a new library. A church volunteered to let the school hold sessions at their site until the new Banneker School was finished in 1915. Banneker was the site where the majority of Bloomington's Black students were educated up through grade 8 until it closed in 1951. In 1949, the Indiana State Legislature passed school desegregation laws. Part of Fairview School was torn down in 1950, so all 5th and 6th grade students from that school were to attend classes at Banneker. But white parents voiced vehement objections against their children attending Banneker, so the name was changed to Fairview Annex. After the addition was completed at Fairview, all students were integrated at that site, and Banneker was closed. In the following clip, Betty Bridgwaters shares a story about one of her experiences as a high school student in Bloomington.
There was another um, experience that I really grieved because I believe it was my sophomore year. I had taken biology, the regular biology, with Mr. Chrysler, and he had told me that he had an advanced biology class and invited me to take that. And I said, and he said, would you like to do that? And I said, oh, yes. And he says, okay, well, you can sign up for it. So when I was making out my class course schedule, I told Mrs. Dodds, who sort of went with my class, each year she would rotate on instead of staying put. So she was still the counselor. And I told her, and I said, and I want to take the advanced biology class. And she looked at me and she says, oh, well, that's only offered the second semester. And I said, okay. I said, well, Mr. Chrysler had, suggested that I take it. And I said, I really want to do that. As it happened, I saw Mr. Chrysler in the hall. I don't know, it was maybe 3-4 weeks into the semester. And he stopped me and he says, Becky, I thought you were trying to be in my advanced class. And I said, yes, I'll be in it next semester. I said, Mrs. Dodds signed me up. And he looked at me and he says, it's only offered the first semester. I was speechless. I didn't know what to say. I was so hurt. I guess, most people would be, I was just hurt because he seemed offended that I didn't sign up for the class after he had invited me to. Mm-hmm. And I wanted, biology was one of my favorite classes. I mean, that's, I really loved it. So that was a disappointment.
Prior to 1963, there were no Black teachers in the Monroe County school system except at Banneker. When Banneker closed in 1951, they forced Georgia Porter, one of the remaining teachers, to retire and placed the other, Alice Evans, on the library staff at Bloomington High School, rather than allow her to continue teaching white students. In 1963, Laverta Terry became the first Black tenured teacher to teach within Monroe County's public schools. In 1944, she won a scholarship to the Indiana University School of Music, but left after being refused housing in IU's residence halls and after the dining halls had refused to serve her lunch while she was here auditioning. At that point, she decided to leave IU and attend school in Mississippi. She returned to Bloomington with her husband in 1948 and first applied for a teaching job in 1949. She was told by the superintendent that before they had a Negro teacher in Bloomington schools, they would have to step over his dead body. She was told that the Blacks and whites had always gotten along in Bloomington, and it was best not to rock the boat. More than a decade later, her son was a star player on Bloomington High School's basketball team. When word got out that the family was planning to move away, there was a renewed interest on the part of the school district to give Laverta a teaching position. She initially responded that she did not want a job that was dependent on her son's athletic abilities, but she was encouraged by the community to reconsider as a means of opening an employment door that had previously been closed to Blacks in Bloomington. She eventually accepted a substitute teaching position in 1962 and a full-time teaching position in 1963.
All right, we'd now like to give everyone just a chance to stretch and take care of bathroom breaks and need to refill your coffee cup or glass of water, and we will resume at 12:15.
And I'd remind everyone, if you do have questions, please feel free to put those in the Q&A feature for our panelists, and we'll be sure to have those at the end. So thank you. Let's 5-minute break. Back at 12:15.
All right, I think we're ready to go again. And I just wanted to note, I think I had gotten a question about the Jacob Lawrence prints, and we have a link to more information about that, including access to other prints within the series as part of the handout that we're going to provide. And I'm wondering if one of the folks from the IU Alumni Association might be able to paste that into the chat so everybody would be able to see that resource. And there are a whole host of other resources that relate to today's presentation. So if you want to do a little deeper dive on any of these topics, that's going to be a great resource for you to check out and explore further. So again, if we can get that pasted into chat, you are welcome to check that out, and we'll keep striving to add more things to it as we locate them as well to help continue people's understanding of the topics that we're discussing today. But now I would like to welcome people back from our break and turn things over to Glenda Murray to take us on the second half of our historical journey today.
Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to hearing questions and comments when we get to the end. In the early days at IU, there were Black students who took classes and some earned certificates, but Marcellus Neal, on your right, and Preston Emmanuel Eagleson in this shot, and also Abraham Joseph King became the first Black students to enroll in degree programs. In 1895, Marcellus Neal became the first Black student to graduate from IU with a Bachelor of Arts in Mathematics. Preston Eagleson was the first Black scholar athlete at IU and went on to become the first Black student to receive a master's degree in philosophy from IU in 1906. Preston was a member of IU's football and baseball teams during the first part of his academic career. On an overnight trip with the football team to Crawfordsville, he was refused lodging with the other members of the team. Not an unusual situation. With the help of his father, though, he filed a lawsuit that set a statewide precedent against this type of discrimination. In this clip, Betty talks about her grandfather, Preston Eagleson.
Freshman, he played football and baseball, and he was quite good at both of them. And the coach told him he needed to make a choice, that it was too much, it would take too much out of him. He would not play football as well if he played baseball and vice versa, and he chose football. And he played football freshman, sophomore, and junior year. In his junior year, he played baseball and vice versa, and he chose football. And he played football freshman, sophomore, and junior year. In his junior year, they had told him his teammates came to him and said, watch out because they're going to try to kill you. We called him Preston. One's going to hit you high and one low, and that'll break your back or your neck or something. Anyway, it's fatal when that happens, especially if it hits you hard. So when they were running the play, instead of running the play, he stepped aside and went a different way, and they hit each other and put each other's lights out, literally. Just bam, knocked each other out. And after that, when that season ended, he didn't feel comfortable to go back to play football again. Prior to that, he had a problem when they were had hotel accommodations in Crawfordsville, Indiana. And they wouldn't he was the only Black player, they wouldn't let him stay in the hotel. And here he is with his team and everything, and he doesn't, whether he had money or not, he couldn't stay at the hotel. He didn't have any idea what to do. So he ended up sleeping in the elevator shaft because they wouldn't see him there, after everyone had gone in for the night. He just, I guess, used his coat or whatever, but there's no central heat. And it was in the winter, so you can only imagine how cold it was to spend the night in an elevator shaft. And that was another reason, it kind of making his father sued. He was so upset about that because he could have gotten pneumonia and died. I mean, we didn't have penicillin. Anything could have happened.
So we've talked a little bit about some of the early Black men who attended IU. I want to mention Carrie Parker enrolled in 1898, but she only came for about a year. But Dina Kellums at IU Archives has been thrilled to be able to tell more of that story. In 1919, Frances Marshall, whose picture you see here, became the first Black woman to earn a degree from IU. Frances married Wilson Vachon Eagleson, the son of Preston Eagleson, whom we've just been hearing about. The Neil Marshall Black Culture Center at IU is co-named in honor of Marcellus Neal and Frances Marshall. Betty Elizabeth Eagleson Bridgwaters, the granddaughter of Preston Eagleson, was the first Black person elected as an official in Monroe County. She served on the school board from 1969 to 1977, serving as president for a year. She also ran for mayor and state representative. In the next clip, Betty talks more about her mother.
Well, she decided, the thing that was missing was you do all of this stuff, and she says the problem that we have is if you need to be in the room to set the policy. There's no need to be demonstrating and talking and fussing and arguing or protesting about things. You need to be in the rooms where the decisions are made. That's why she ran for the school board. Later, she ran for the mayor of the city of Bloomington. And then in 75, and she was unsuccessful, so in 76, she ran for state representative of the 51st District of Indiana. She campaigned with Governor Otis Bowen, who was the vice governor at that time, and she campaigned with him in Martinsville. They went door to door and had pictures. So somebody with Mr. and Mrs. Bowen, and she was all over the place. I mean, she was in places that typically you would think Ku Klux Klan would not be favorable. But with Mother, she was so straight up and honest, and she was not a person, and I guess I take a little after her, except she had enough of the racism in her whole life that she had some scars from that. I'm blessed that I'm not scarred. I didn't.
And if you're interested in more about Elizabeth Bridgwaters, there is a wonderful 20-minute clip in the resource page that's being posted. Prior to 1947, Black people who owned homes took in students because the Black students were not permitted to live in the IU residence halls. Instead, the students lived in boarding houses on the east and west sides of campus, including the Mays House, which was a small bungalow at 418 East 8th Street, where Ruth Mays rented rooms to Black male students and served meals to Black students since they were barred from eating on campus. Samuel Dargan, the first Black man to earn a law degree at IU in 1909, also owned several boarding houses. He operated the first private residence hall for Black women, starting around 1925 at 318 North Grant, again, close to campus. He was the curator of the law library for over 40 years. Black students also lived in off-campus sorority and fraternity houses. Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity, founded at IU in 1911 by Elder Watson Diggs, was the first of the African-American fraternities in the US, was one of the first, and it's the only national fraternity that was founded at IU. Black students eventually gained the ability to live on campus after many of the GIs returned following the war, and that led to the decline of the rooming houses. The Black female students had to keep rooming with local residents until 1949, when they were finally permitted to live in campus housing. And here's pictures from some of those houses. We want to talk about George and Vi Taliaferro. George Taliaferro was a star football player at IU and then went on to become the first African-American to be drafted by the NFL. And again, there's a nice clip from him. And he says, and I was the first Black quarterback and the only player to play 7 different positions over the years. While attending IU, George had to run from school back to his dorm, to his home off campus between classes because he couldn't eat on campus or at the local restaurants. However, one day he looked in the window at the Gables and there was a picture of him inside the restaurant. At that point, he went to Herman Wells, and Herman picked up the telephone and told the restaurant owner of the Gables, George Taliaferro and I are coming over. And the restaurant owner said, but we don't serve Blacks. And Herman Wells, in his wonderful calm style, said, well, then I just guess we'll have to make it off limits to all students. And he said, okay, come on over. And that's how they slowly began to make these changes. When George and Vi moved back to Bloomington, he worked in administration at IU for 20 years. Vi went to law school and was appointed and then elected judge in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And she was a fierce defender of children's rights in the legal system. There were 2 periods in the 20th century with the KKK, and as somebody mentioned earlier, we may be getting to another one. But the first one of those, and they had slightly different focuses. The 1920s KKK was against everybody who wasn't white. They didn't like Catholics, they didn't like Jews, they didn't like Blacks, they didn't like immigrants. You had to be a Protestant, a white Protestant. In 1920, about 24% of the native-born men in Monroe County apparently were members of the Ku Klux Klan. And matches the state estimates of KKK members in other communities as well. In the 1960s, the Klansmen were basically white supremacists and mainly against Blacks. During a Bloomington Human Relations Commission meeting in September 1968, 52 years ago, African-American Commission Chairman Ernest Butler showed his fellow commissioners and others present the meeting card, like you see in the corner there, that had been left on his door. It read, "The KKK is watching you." Butler reported that he'd received many of these cards and had received several threatening phone calls as well. And we're now going to hear from Mr. Motley about his experience with the KKK.
Well, I was still in my house. I pictured one of those 9/6 across, so they put the KKK all across. I wanted big bold letters, the whole 96 inches on across my window. And nobody listened to me, and I never said nothing to somebody else. I just left them up there. Anybody here walks, they go up where they could see it, you know. Nobody said nothing to me. I said nothing to nobody else. Nobody. And the night that moved in October 31st, 1968, in the hospital of mine, and they had Halloween, and everybody stopped by, and we gave them rather candy, you know, we gave them pennies and dimes, so free things. Yeah, so that's where I arrived at, how it ended up in Redwood Terrace.
Well, did you have any more problems? You said the KKK put signs up there. Did they follow through, or were they trying to scare you out, or what happened after that?
No, they did not. But I stayed up all night that night. My wife and 2 kids went to bed. I stayed up all night with my equipment because I first medal for shooting in the Air Force. So I think
to be clear, your equipment meant your guns. Is that right?
that's right. That's right. That's just what I see.
So you stayed up all night guarding your house.
Yes, I did.
But they didn't show up? No other problem?
Nobody showed up. Nobody ever showed up.
So what happened to the KKK?
So we were there talking and going back and forth about, what should we do, what can we do, and how terrible it was. The Klan was coming to march. And I said, we need the mayor here. I said, where is the mayor? So 2 students and I walked over to City Hall and got him. He was still there in his office. And got him and had him. We walked back to the church. He finished up what he was doing and got in the car. He said, well, I'll come over, when I finish this. So he finished what he was doing and got in his car and came to the church and met with us. And he assured us that he would not approve or permit for them to march. And he didn't. And they did.
Yeah. And now looking again at campus. When Thomas Atkins was elected as IU's first Black student body president in 1961, there were crosses burned in Dunn Meadow, but he served that year. In 1968, students formed the Afro-American Student Association. On the day before the 1968 Little 500 race, 50 students staged a 38-hour sit-in at Memorial Stadium, demanding the removal of discriminatory clauses from the charters of the Greek chapters. Only one of the chapters could not get their national chapter to change, and they did not get to ride bikes in the race, but the others all got their national chapters to change. In the fall of 1968, at the site of what is now People's Park, Black students and faculty members opened the black market to sell books, records, artwork, clothing, jewelry, variety of things imported from Africa and made by African Americans. After being open about 3 months, on December 26th, the black market was firebombed and ruined. In 1969, 2 local men, both who were members of the KKK, confessed to the crime, and the area was later donated to the city and became People's Park. Also want to talk a little bit about Reverend Martin Chandler. And there is also an excellent WTIU video that you can access. Marvin moved with his family to Indiana in 1939. He graduated from Bloomington High School in 1947. But he started playing the piano when he was 4 years old, and he played by ear. Along with his 2 sisters, Marcella and Marlene, they became part of the Chandler Trio. The group regularly performed on WTTW, which was Bloomington's television station, one of the early television stations, earning the distinction of being the first African Americans to have a televised show in the Midwest, perhaps in the whole country. They also appeared on the Arthur Godfrey Show. In 1960s, Marvin moved his family to New York, where he attended seminary, and as the job that went with that, he served as pastor to 39 migrant camps of mostly Black workers. Then he attended the March on Washington in 1963. His reputation in the area grew, and in 1971, with the Attica prison riots, which were the worst prison riots in the country, Reverend Chandler and Reverend Scott were called in as mediators. They were unsuccessful in negotiating a peaceful end, and the police killed 37 people in closing down that riot and that prison. But he had tried and worked really hard and earned the respect of the prisoners. When the family returned to Indiana after a few years in California, Reverend Chandler became involved in the Indianapolis jazz scene as well as his music, as well as his ministry. In the later part of the 20th century, Reverend Butler, the longtime pastor at Second Baptist, and Clarence Gilliam, the longtime head of the local NAACP, helped push for changes locally. They helped to further integrate employment, getting people positions other than janitor, etc., and to fight housing discrimination. In the 1980s, there were efforts to fight redlining policies, again in Bloomington. The latter half of the 20th century was a time of progress, but there were also setbacks. The savage police beatings and shootings of Black people that have gained national attention recently are not new. In 1983, the Bloomington police fatally shot Denver Smith, who was a former IU football player, which sparked considerable local debate and outrage. Again, we would point out there are other kinds of hate crimes as well. In 1999, our community witnessed the racially motivated murder of the Korean student Won Jun-yoon outside his church on the east side of Bloomington at the hands of a white supremacist who then went to Chicago and killed a Black man. In politics, Paul Swain was elected to the city council in 1991-95, but it took until 2017 when Jim Sims began serving a term on the city council to get the second Black elected official. There have also been Black judges, but only a few people of color have served an elective office in Monroe County or in Bloomington. The following clip features Liz and Jim talking about what it's like to be an African American in Bloomington in the later part of the 20th century.
I came here in May of 1978. I was the first Black trooper in the Bloomington district. Initially, they were going to send me to Greene County, but then the sergeant of the post realized that Greene County would be a terrible culture shock. So luckily, a trooper was building a home in Greene County, so he went to Greene County and I could stay in Monroe. Bloomington was not that bad for me initially, or at all, until I got to go to some of the restaurants with other troopers and see the stuff written on the bathroom walls. And there were a lot of not so nice things written on walls.
To be assigned here. My very first day on the job, a man sitting there said, "What is this Black heifer doing in here?" For about the first year, I had to tolerate being called the N-word every night, told why was I there. You know, I was asked, "Why are you here? You're taking the job of a white man. Your husband's a state police officer. You know, you need to be at home." There were no bathrooms. I think there were 2 women, maybe 3. So they didn't want women in there, period. It didn't matter what color you were. So to allow women in there, they had to accommodate us with bathrooms. And this was on 4th Street. Mm-hmm. So I reported what was going on to the postmaster at that time, and he told me there was no racism in Bloomington. And then I spoke to a man who eventually became postmaster, but at the time I talked to him, he said, "Stick it out for a year, let them get to know you, and things will be okay. Or I could go ahead and go outside of Bloomington to report what was happening." And he said, "Life would be worse for you if you did that than it is now." So I went to work regardless. And I just said, when they would say, "You need to leave," I'd say, "Well, you leave, because I'm staying." like he said, after about a year, things got a whole lot better. But I've never forgotten those people. And now they want to at me and want to meet me for lunch and and all of that. One guy, the guy that called me a black heifer, as he was dying, he told someone to tell Liz goodbye. And I figured that was his way of apologizing.
Despite all this progress, challenges and oppression still exist nationwide and within our community. The fights for fair and equitable housing still continues. Proposed zoning changes for parts of Bloomington's west side seek to allow for higher density that may have detrimental effects on longtime Black families still residing in the area. KKK flyers were posted on campus last year, and there were mass protests in response to a Bloomington farmers market vendor with ties to a white supremacy group. Over the past 5 years, Monroe County residents supporting an end to police slayings and brutality against Blacks have engaged in a number of Black Lives Matter rallies and marches, including one this summer when hundreds of people flooded Bloomington streets with their masks, mostly, even in the midst of the pandemic. And I'll turn things over to Jennifer so that we can move to some further comments before we get to questions and answers.
Thank you, Glenda. And like Glenda said, we are going to open things up for questions and answers, and we're going to be pulling those from the chat. So if you have a question that you would like to ask, we're going to get some of the other presenters involved in helping to answer those in just a minute. But one of the cool and interesting things about history is that it's not just a thing in the past, it's constantly being made. And so we wanted to take a moment as we concluded the formal part of the presentation to reflect a little bit on what it's like to be a Black resident of Monroe County today. And that was a question that we posed to several of the co-presenters and people who are featured in today's presentation. So I wanted to start with a quote that Audrey had provided. Audrey, did you want to say anything in addition to that quote?
Well, yes, just simply to read the quote. When I was asked what would be parting statement, or this is what I came up with. Many of our white brothers and sisters are in a state of denial, even here in Bloomington. They deny systemic racism. They deny that Black Lives Matter. They deny white privilege. If I could but pry open those closed minds, I would remind our white brothers and sisters that white privilege begins with the fact that whatever obstacles they face, whites face in America, it was not and is not because of their race or the color of their skin. Even a closed mind, Fox viewing white person must admit that that has not been the case for most Black Americans.
Thank you, Audrey. Was Betty able to hop on? If not, we'll go on. And Liz and Jim, I had a chance to talk with you earlier this month. Liz, I know you're on live today. Would you like to reflect live, or do you want me to play that clip that I had recorded earlier?
Let's play the clip because I don't remember what I said.
Well, no, see if you have anything to add. So that's perfect.
Yeah, I'll add if I need to, yeah.
Is there still racism in Bloomington? And what's different now than then?
Absolutely. What's more difficult now is it's covert, but nothing's changed. You know, you just look at, you've never had a Black woman on the fire department. Why not? I've asked that question. I think now you have one Black female on the police department, and in the history of the police department, she's number 2. That's a problem for me. There's no Blacks helping to run the city in key positions. It never has been. That's problematic. At one time, we tried to get a loan at one of the banks, And, you know, we have excellent credit. And they told us it was best for us to go seek getting help with a mortgage loan somewhere else. So a lot of things are there. It's hard for my grandchildren to see it and to recognize it, but it's definitely there. A lot of people don't understand the Black Lives Matter movement, and I've had to explain that all lives should matter, but they don't. So ask the American Indians if their lives matter when Europeans wanted this land. Did their lives matter? Did the Japanese lives matter at one point? And the Blacks' lives have never mattered. And I don't understand people getting upset because I want to soothe myself and say that it's not true. I know my life doesn't really matter, or a Black man's life doesn't matter. So all it is just something to make us feel a little bit better. So nobody should get upset about that, because the truth is their lives don't matter. So that's something too. And here in Bloomington's always been about 50-50, even about during slavery. You had people that were helping with the Underground Railroad, but you had slave catchers here too, and they live right on the square.
Liz, did you have anything you would like to add?
No, that pretty much covers it. We still have a lot of work to do. Well, one thing that kind of bothers me, and it's happening in other cities, not just in Bloomington, just erasing structures pertaining to the Black community, being bought up, or figuring out a way to take that away. It's happened here on the West Side. We've lost something that was really important to the Black community, and that was the Elks Lodge, the Hole. I would like to see that saved and preserved. It was very important to the Black community as much as the churches were. And so I'd like to see that resurrected and saved. Those kind of things are happening in all the cities. In Indianapolis now, there's a big uproar about them trying to build apartments on Indiana Avenue. The buildings and structures that were really important to Blacks at that time are gone, like the Black YMCA that was built by Madam C.J. Walker. It's gone. We're not in the position of authority to say, hey, this is important to us. This is important to the Black community. And so that bothers me still, that those kind of things are happening. So I hope that here in Bloomington, we can kind of change things around. Things that are important to minorities are to be important to whites, and let's save that part of the history. And I'd say start with the Whole. Let's save it, let's resurrect the Whole.
Thank you. And I did hear that Betty is on and has her mic unmuted, so I'll go back. Betty, do you want to say a few words and reflect on your experiences today?
I don't hear.
I'll come back again. I'm going to play one more clip from Robert Motley, and he had some sage advice to share as part of the interview that we had done with him.
Be gentle, be courteous, don't try to overpower people. Talk to people, okay? And let them know how you feel. And just be yourself. Don't let nobody force you into our language or, whatever.
Mm-hmm. That's very good advice. Very good advice.
So on that note, we're going to open things up to some of the questions that have come in, and I think Trisha's going to pose some of those, and I'll invite any of the presenters, but especially Liz and Audrey, to share out responses as those come in.
Great. Yeah, we do have a couple of questions. Can someone talk a little bit about the Showers Furniture Factory and how it affected Blacks in the community in all aspects like housing, education, and retail?
Well, I'll start off, and Audrey, you can back me up. From what I know, the Showers building was ahead of its time. They hired women, and they hired African-American laborers. Black people, like it was mentioned before, lived in what was called by whites as Bucktown. Blacks didn't call it that. And so that was on the east side. And that was great. That gave these job opportunities to African Americans where otherwise they wouldn't have had, they'd had service jobs. I like the fact that the Showers women were involved in a lot of things. They came in on the floors and said, you know, we wanted women to vote, and they were active in that. And some of the Black women locally participated in that, and that was their maids, Mattie Jacobs Fuller. So that was, I thought Showers building was an integral part in the Black neighborhood. Then when they moved over to the west side, they still wanted to help African Americans attain houses and get an education. I don't know if there was a pay disparity or not, whether whether you got paid more if you were white. I hadn't looked into that, but Showers building really did a lot to as far as employment.
I would just add, that was very complete, Liz. As far as I know, you are really the authority now on Black history in Monroe County. So I certainly endorse that. But I would just say something about the term Bucktown. That was actually a pejorative that was not only in Bloomington, but there were several Black communities. Even my husband, in his Middletown home, they had a section of the town called Bucktown. And that was a pejorative for African Americans, and that was very widespread.
Great, thank you. Any other comments about the Showers Furniture Factory and how it affected our community?
I would just, this is Glenda, I would just suggest to folks Carol Krause's book about the Showers Factory. And among the things she talked about were that savings and loan that was already mentioned, that people who worked at Showers, Black and white, could borrow money and be able to buy a house. And then there were teams and there were other activities for people who worked at Showers. So that's what I know about Showers. And I would, if everybody has seen Charlotte Zitlow's comment, Tabitha Eagleson was on the Board of Works for many years, and I should have remembered that. Mayor Frank McCloskey appointed her. So she's one more of those folks. She was not an elected official, but she had a position of responsibility.
One thing I'd like to add to that, and Showers was instrumental in this with their employment. Back in the day, the majority of the Blacks owned their own homes and did not seek government assistance. So I know the History Center, AJ had contacted me about who had lived on the Hill under Section 8. Well, there was a time Blacks didn't live on Section 8. They were proud homeowners.
Thank you. We got the question, speaking about Bucktown, how did African Americans refer to that part of town?
Well, it appears to me whites have to label people and put people in their slots. Who's Black, who's white, and name things. I don't know, maybe Betty knows what they referred. I just know that was the terminology that whites used, calling that area Bucktown.
This is Vivian, I'm Betty's sister.
Okay, let me put my glasses on. You look just like her, okay.
Yeah. But no, Black people that lived in that area they called Bucktown did not call it that.
That's right.
We simply said we lived on the west side. And actually, I had some T-shirts made up for some of my family members that say straight out of West Side. But no, we didn't call it Bucktown. Like Audrey said, it was a pejorative. It was a negative way of referring, you know, to where Black people were on the other side of the tracks, or, you know, where we were redlined to be in those days. Which is why, even having moved back to Bloomington, I made my home here on what they now call the near West Side, versus other places I could have lived, because we used to not be welcome. And so I wanted to be, as they say, back on the block where I knew I would be welcome.
Great, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Glenda, you mentioned about positions of authority and no Black people in positions of authority running the city. Are you speaking of city government or in some other way?
I was referring in general to elected office. But as we begin to think about who was in appointed office, that does help a little bit in terms of thinking. But it's a matter of representation. And that's why I brought the subject up, because as we think about who should be running for office, for years, as somebody who worked in women's history, I'd say we need more elected women. When I worked in city government in the 80s, the mayor was a woman, the head of the controller was a woman, I was the redevelopment director. There were just a lot of, there were lots of women. And then it switched the other way. And that's what we have to think about in terms of electing people of color or electing male or female, is how do we get better representation? And I would say Doris Sims and Beverly Callender Anderson, or at least who was on in the beginning, are now wonderful representatives in city government.
Thank you. Beverly does say the question came from Liz's video. The city has 2 Black elected officials, Jim Sims on city council and Nicole Bolden is our city clerk.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
And I forgot both Nicole Brown and Nicole Bolden. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the questions that came in has been a very enlightening session so far. Knew some of the information, but not near all of it. I think a lot of us are probably thinking that. My question is, what has Indiana University done over the years to help address these problems?
I interviewed a man, and he doesn't mind me saying who he is, Ronnie Bland. He blames a lot of problems on the city of Bloomington on the IU, said they could have done better. There was racism there, where Blacks couldn't stay on campus, you couldn't eat there. Where's all that come from? And how did it stay around here so long? You had people coming from all over the world to IU, to Bloomington, to go to IU, and here they were practicing blatantly racism, and up and through the 70s even. So since I didn't come to late 70s, I interviewed this man who was born and raised here. He's now 87 years old. He blames IU for a lot of Bloomington's problems. So I'd say, based on his interview, I wouldn't give kudos to IU.
I would add that, just using a quote from Frederick Douglass, that power concedes nothing without demand. And IU has not been in the forefront unless there was demand. We got Blacks living in the dorms through demand. We got Black studies through demand. If students had not taken over administration building, if athletes had not boycotted, there would have not been any kind of self-interest, let's do the right thing. And so I think at this pivotal moment now, where we see we are at a crossroads in terms of where we go forward or whether we move back, that we should remember that history does not move in a straight line in terms of progress. It zigs and it zags, you know, whether we're in the zig or zag phase. It just means that we have to be really diligent about pressing and making demands on power, and that's including IU. And to use Martin Luther King's quote about the arc of the moral universe leads towards freedom. Well, there's a part of that that I like. I like that sentiment. But what is unsaid, and what I think Martin Luther King meant and showed through his life, was that it only bends towards freedom and justice with agitation, with demand, with struggle, with allies. And so we just can't take that quote and think that it's going to automatically happen. And that's the same with IU. IU could be doing much more than it's doing, but it's up to us to put pressure on IU and even the city government everywhere, to put pressure on it in order to make the changes that we need and deserve.
Thank you. Thanks,
Trisha, I know Betty is on now, and so I don't know if we could, if she needs to be moved over to presenter so that she's able to share out. But I know we're right up at the one o'clock hour, but I just wanted to give her a quick chance to say something, because she is also someone who knows so much and has a lot to say on a lot of the things that we've talked about today, in addition to the short clips that we had shared.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, Betty.
Hey.
I can't believe it. I've just, what was it, 5 minutes ago or less that you finally have me connected. I have been here the entire time. I'm so sorry. Is there no video for me?
We can see you.
I can see you.
Okay, well, I can't see, what's going on. Anyway, this has been a wonderful experience. There is much of our history that's a little misrepresented here, but in the main, it's fairly accurate for Bloomington and the experiences. Speaking of Bucktown was not a black district. It had some black people. It was all blue-collar workers. If you remember when the railroad came through, they hired a lot of blacks to do that. And they also had white workers there. So on Friday, when the Eagle would fly and they would get paid, most of them would go out and get their wine and other beer and other things and party. Or they would eat, they would have, joint meals and things of that, and really socialize, play cards, and it was loud and noisy. So many of the black people who did live there, especially the church people, were uncomfortable with that environment, and they made every effort to purchase homes. Yes, it was redlined and pretty much restricted to the west side until we had the Fair Housing Ordinance and all of that passed in the later years. But there were black people who owned property. The two purchased plots of land when the city was founded in 1818. But then there were large portions of land away from those communities you identified. People owned land on the north side. The Drakes had Madison and 17th, which is not the west side, per se, because it was far north. There were two Nichols, Jim Nichols and John Nichols. One had a farm on the west side, and the other brother had land on the east side, where the stadium is presently located across the street, where those apartment buildings are, from 17th Street on down. That was owned by him. His home was on Dunn Street, just south of 17th on the east side, but he owned all of that property all the way down to the church there before the bypass, and east down to almost to Walnut Street. So that was a very large portion of land that was owned by a black man. So to say all black people lived on the west side, no. And it was just, and then you had the Covenanter area. But the majority of black people, and it wasn't a black neighborhood. I looked there, the people across the street from me were white, next door to me, they were white, and the people who lived behind us were white. The ones next door to the west were black. So if you have 2 or 3 or 4 families in a square block, that's not exactly a Black neighborhood. However, in my humble opinion, and in the 3 blocks here on 7th and 8th Street, that's probably the only area that you could do that, because everywhere else there was a majority white people. In one house here and one house there, it was, you know, Black residents. And on Kirkwood, there were several Black residents.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead and ask the question.
No, I was taking it in terms of a kind of conclusive statement, because I saw that one question in the chat was,
Absolutely.
In the chat was about where do we go from here, or what do we do next? And I just wanted to address that by saying that Black people have been historically tasked with being the moral compass of this country. You know, we judge ourselves as sort of the metaphor, as Richard Wright says, of America. But I like to turn the question back to our white majority. Where do you go from here?
Hello.
Because it has been actually phrased as a Black problem, but I don't see it as a Black problem. I see it as a white majority problem. So rather than ask us or ask Black people who have been historically oppressed, I would ask whites, particularly allies or people who want to see this country move forward, what are you doing in the interest of using your white privilege, and I defined it earlier, to assist Blacks in making this country a better country? So I think you should turn the question internally and ask every day, what are you doing? Am I doing something to advance or to just have the status quo or even moving backwards? And so I think that's a moral question that we all should be facing right now.
And to piggyback what Audrey just said, to piggyback that, I'd like to see a panel of white men with questions taken by African Americans, asking those very questions. What are you doing? And to tell us, what are the problems? What do you have against Blacks? Or what do you know about your ancestors, how you were raised? You tell us what your problem is. I'd like to know that from white men. What's your problem?
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists today and for everyone joining us. We really appreciate Glenda, Susan, Jennifer, Liz, Betty, Audrey, thank you. Vivian, thank you, welcome. Our next session is October 1st at the same time on our local economy and tourism amidst the pandemic. We have a fantastic panel lined up, moderated by Erin Predmore from the Chamber of Commerce. Please check out our website and registration details for that event, as well as one on October 8th, featuring a preview of our local and state elections. So all are welcome to join us for those. With promo code LBMC 2021, you can register for free for both of those sessions, a perk of joining us today. So thank you for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, and we look forward to seeing you all in October. Thank you so much.
Thank you.